Welcome to Sci Philipod. I am the host, Benjamin Weingard, with the still unlocated, I mean, located somewhere, but unknown location.
Off the grid still, co-host humbly from somewhere in the Midwest, Bo Weingard.
And this week, there's obviously a lot going on with the inauguration and a flurry of executive orders, as well as a ambitious Biden administration legislative agenda. So what we're going to do is give maybe kind of a overview of the inauguration and what the Biden administration's plans that they've kind of choreographed are big picture. Right. Then we'll dive into the good, the bad, and the ugly of the executive orders, and then talk about what we know of the early Biden administration legislative agenda, and finish up with the article of the week. This week, it's Michael Brendan Doherty's Trumpism After Trump, and that will lead us to a discussion about populism as well.
Yeah, it's like the seventh article named that, I realized.
It's obviously a important political question on the right, so understandable. Yes. So obviously we had the inauguration. Even before that, though, I think we had a pretty good idea of what the Biden administration was going to attempt. So there was this memo that was leaked. I mean, obviously it was intentionally leaked, that Ronald Klain, the White House chief of staff, had written to other senior incoming administration figures that noted what they wanted to do was address four crises: the COVID-19 crisis, the economic crisis, racial equity crisis, and then the climate crisis.
Right. So we should say, before getting into any of the executive orders or the legislation or the sort of adumbrated vision of the Biden administration, what was the speech like? So that is obviously a moment for Biden to give voice to his vision of his administration in more poetic terms than in some sort of legislative memo. So the speech was, I would say it was reasonably well written, but somewhat forgettable. You didn't get any phrases like "ask not what you can" or "what your country can do for you," etc. But those don't come along very often. And I think even if Biden had a line like that, he couldn't deliver it the way Kennedy did. So it probably wouldn't matter, which is fine. That's Biden's style. A lot of the sort of main theme, or one of the leitmotifs of the speech, was unity, right? Bringing unity to a fractured country. So clearly this is something Biden has talked about on a number of occasions. And before getting into how the legislative agenda sheds light on that or belies that, I would note that the disappointing thing about the speech, from my view, was that there was nothing in it, even rhetorically, that actually signaled the compromise to conservatives and to the concerns of conservatives or Trump voters, right?
That's right.
And so if you want to promote unity, it's really easy to say unity is great. But if you're not even willing to give some rhetorical victories to the other side, it's going to be hard actually to promote unity.
It seems as though the Biden administration's view of unity is to absolutely smash the remnants of Trumpism.
Yes.
And then move forward where your Overton window of legitimate political debate runs through from Romney to AOC, apparently. And this is clear in the inauguration speech, where he noted that we have this rise of political extremism, white supremacy, and domestic terrorism that we will confront and defeat.
Right.
And if you were not necessarily MAGA, but even somewhat sympathetic to Trump, you could obviously interpret that as an attempt by the Biden administration to kind of snuff that view of politics out, that kind of right-wing populism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think it was that hidden, right? I think it's pretty clear what the message is. The message is, if you're a part of that kind of Tucker Carlson populist, curious at least, coalition, you're going to get crushed and you're not going to be treated as a normal member of the political community. So it's basically this attitude that everything from G.W. Bush to the Obama coalition to AOC is legitimate. And if you're outside of that, then you don't count as a member for whom the unity message is meant, because you're outside of the legitimate political community. And I think that's really unfortunate, because there are a lot of people outside of that circle, a lot of people.
Yeah, I agree. I wasn't overly impressed with the speech or the I mean, I like the message of unity and healing, obviously, after the last 4 years, but the substance matters, and that kind of rhetoric, I think, is unnecessarily divisive and unnecessary.
Yeah, and also, I mean, unity requires sacrifice and compromise, and that's an important thing. And also, if you're going to talk about extremism, you could have just had 1 or 2 sentences about left-wing extremism over the summer that would have made your speech sound much more earnest when you made your claims of unifying the country much more earnest. But instead, you didn't talk about anything that would potentially alienate or anger a liberal or even progressive who listened to the speech.
Yeah, it's the type of speech that would be written by a progressive triumphalist who views that kind of the successor ideology has basically already won.
Yeah,
or will soon win.
It's the speech of the victors who are just picking off. They've conquered the territory and now they're just picking people off. And they're like, yeah, we'll unify on our terms completely and wholly, right?
Yeah, and it's also unfortunate because I think Biden himself, his own instinct is not to have that attitude, to be more conciliatory and more of a Truman type Democrat who's really centrist. But I think he also has this desire to placate his own base. As people have noted, Biden is basically always in the center of the Democratic Party.
Right. So in other words, he's not really a moderate. He's a centrist in his party. And if the party is radical on an issue, which I think it is on demographic issues, then he's pretty radical too.
That's right. And it's unclear the extent to which he understands the divisiveness of some of the culture war stuff, because he's somewhat aloof from that. So he, in good faith, will use these buzzwords that younger people know that they kind of have 2 meanings, right? They have a literal meaning and then more of this progressive political meaning. Not sure how much of that Biden realizes.
Yes. So I think,
although it doesn't really matter, because what matters is that he's on board with that part of the Democratic coalition.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost the sort of gloomy prospect, is that he's completely unaware that there's this large coalition of people who feel alienated by this. And he legitimately thinks, well, reasonable discourse runs from Mitt Romney to Alexandria Cortez, right? And that these other people, it's a small group of, inflamed conspiracists.
Yeah, although, so before the inauguration, he gave this interview with Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, where he does evince some awareness, right? So he talked about America first, not entering new trade agreements until we've invested in America. He even talked about the importance of not leaving rural America behind. And he said,
Mm.
quote, I think they just feel forgotten. I think we forgot them, and laid out these ideas for how to improve rural life, including building up healthcare infrastructure in rural America, more hospitals, the public option. So yeah, he's an interesting figure in his how clear his understanding of current political argot is.
Well, there's always been, well, not always, but in the past, say 30 years, the Democratic coalition has been roiled by a kind of tension between the hyper-educated woke part and the more traditional union white rural, middle class voters and the white down and out. And so it's you can imagine it's not surprising that especially an older white male would have some sympathy for some of those views on at least on economic issues. I think
Yeah,
the problem
and
is there's not a lot of sympathy for the cultural views and grievances.
yes, agree. So the inauguration speech, somewhat disappointing, forgettable, I think is the best summary. Like nobody's going to be quoting this
Yeah,
6 months from now.
yeah.
It really just
I mean, the only way they would be quoting it is to denounce it because they will be saying, yeah, this is what unity looks like or something, right?
yeah. I mean, the
So it'll be
takeaway
bitter mockery.
takeaway from the inauguration was the Bernie Sanders memes, really.
Yeah, that was the best thing to come from the inauguration for sure.
So, as I noted, then there's this memo that was released before the inauguration. So the Biden administration sees these four crises, again, economic, the pandemic, racial equity, and climate.
Mhm.
And their idea was first you would have this flurry of executive actions, then you would move to uh, this strengthening Buy American provision, supporting equity, communities of color, other underserved communities, and then the kind of end of the first 100 days would focus on criminal justice reform, healthcare access, and immigration.
Mhm.
And we started then with the executive actions, obviously, because those can be done unilaterally. And there was
And
indeed
because,
a flurry of them.
right, and because so much of Trump's presidency was based on executive orders, it was pretty easy quickly to erase him.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, there's
Yes.
always this problem of this ratcheting arms race of executive order administration, administrative policies, because when your agenda is passed through executive order, then it is vulnerable to executive order,
Mhm.
especially if you only get 4 years. If you have 8 years, you can sort of change the facts on the ground a lot more. So it's harder to, it's just like there's inertia at that point.
Yeah.
I
Although,
think a lot of these things with Trump are going to be easier to reverse or get rid of.
right. And the Obama administration was somewhat prudent or restrained on executive order early,
Yeah.
and then increasingly grew to rely upon them, especially at the tail end of his second term.
Well, early it was easier to be because they dominated all of the government. I mean, they had the
That's right.
House, the Senate, a super majority in the Senate. So
Yes,
yeah,
that's right. So
yeah.
the executive orders, the Biden administration, Biden signed 17 on the first day of office, and then they've signed more since. Some of these I think are good executive orders. Some of them are meh, and some of them are quite worrisome. So do you want to
Yes.
start with the good?
Yeah, let's start with the good because I think those ones are maybe more straightforward.
Yeah, I think so. So good Biden executive order to increase SNAP benefits by 15%, uh, increase the pandemic EBT. So this is a card that children in school who would normally be getting school lunches can use to get food by
Right.
15%. They did an executive order to improve collective bargaining among federal workers and to lay the groundwork for a $15 minimum wage for federal workers. Now, that's something that the Biden administration can do. They don't need the Congress for that. The increasing the SNAP benefits, I think that's an extremely good order because
Well, but one thing to consider before thinking about the actual substance of the EOs is this a good strategy of governance, even if you like the substance? Is it constitutional? I don't know. I mean, we'd have to take each case. Certainly some EOs are constitutional, but it is this, there is this trend of increasing the power of the presidency, making an
yes,
imperial presidency, if you will.
yes,
And this is obviously a trend that's encouraged by the behavior of the Congress and by the Congress's
yes,
dereliction of its duty.
yes. I think
But
especially the Senate and the
yeah,
use of the filibuster.
well, I'm fond of the filibuster. I think it's there are many things going on there, but um, it's lamentable to see the Senate, the Congress in general, abrogate its own duties and to give up its own power voluntarily because it's easier and it's more politically convenient. So I'm
Yeah,
not really a
quite,
fan.
quite contrary to the expectations of the founding fathers to have a
Yes,
branch of government
voluntarily.
willingly cede its prerogatives to.
Yeah, this is why a party system is so different from what was imagined in 1787, 88, 89, right?
Right.
And so I'm not really a fan of EOs. So we'll just set that aside though.
Yeah,
And
I would agree with that. And my general kind of philosophical orientation would be that, yeah, it's problematic. However, the executive orders that are specifically addressing the pandemic and indirect effects of the pandemic, I think are justified, right? Because these are things that we have to do now.
they're at least defensible. I mean, I'd have to think about each one carefully, but obviously that's not going to happen. So we'll just assume like some of these are going to be considered a perfectly legitimate way to govern, and I'm just going to accept that for the time being.
Right. So the increase in SNAP benefits, I think that's excellent policy because not only are you getting food to desperately poor children, but also it indirectly supports and sustains jobs in the transportation sector of the economy and food services. So it has indirect effects. I think the one estimate I looked at said about 14,000 jobs are sustained by an extra billion in spending on SNAP benefits. So overall, that seems like a generally a good executive order. There was also a directive mandating mask usage among all federal workers in all federal property.
Yeah.
Went further and mandated mask usage in airports on many planes, trains, ships, and intercity buses. Unclear whether that's constitutional and exactly who that applies to or how you would enforce it.
Yeah. So I'm kind of agnostic on the wisdom of that policy. I mean, I don't know how you're going to enforce it. I think it's good at minimum to encourage mask usage, and we can't get into the evidence on mask usage. I
Right.
think it's overstated by liberals, by many on the left, but there's probably mask wearing does reduce the spread somewhat, and the cost is pretty low.
Yeah.
So I'm in favor of it, and I think we should encourage it. I don't know about mandating it. I don't know you're not really going to enforce that. So I don't know exactly the wisdom of that. I'm agnostic on that.
Yeah, I'm agnostic as well. So he also extended a moratorium on evictions. They prolonged a moratorium on foreclosures. This applies to all federally guaranteed mortgages. Again, that was something the Trump administration had done. This is just extending it. They also extended the pause on federal student loan interest and principal payments this through the end of September. Now this one is interesting because there's been a lot of debate about whether Biden should use executive action to actually cancel student debt. There was some thought, or still is some thought, that he might cancel $10,000 of student debt. And I know that people further in the left of the party want him to cancel $50,000 of debt. Now, again, we're not going to get into that debate. Now, I would say that generally I'm favorable toward these executive actions, right? And again, they're bipartisan. I mean, Trump administration supported them.
You're not going to get a lot of backlash on these ones,
right? He also issued a temporary moratorium on oil and gas leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I have literally no opinion on that.
Yeah, I don't either. But it is, I guess it might be related to the XL, the Keystone XL, which people have strong opinions about.
Yes.
And this goes to, it's kind of that policy is probably mostly symbolic, and maybe the Keystone XL is. There's debate on that, but it does whip up passions.
Yes. So he also reversed the rollbacks on vehicle emission standards that the Trump administration had put in place. On that, I'd say that's probably also symbolic because the auto industry is moving rapidly toward fuel efficient vehicles. Even, I mean, Ford's releasing a line of electronic vehicles, Tesla and so on. So it probably doesn't actually do much, but it is a sop to the environmentalists in the Democratic coalition. Another sop to them is the rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, which will officially take place in 30 days. I don't have much of an opinion on that. I mean, I think it's symbolic not only to environmentalists, but to our allies that have signed on to it. It doesn't seem like it will have much of a concrete effect on our economy one way or the other. I have seen that some of the more Trumpy type conservatives are demagoguing it a bit, talking about how.
Well, that's what you get with these symbolic issues, is that people go a little bit, get a little over enthusiastic on either side of them. I mean,
yes,
I don't think this doesn't really do any, from what I could tell, and from reading experts on it, it doesn't really do much either way. So
that's right.
It's almost exclusively symbolic. If it improves relations with Europe, I'm happy with it.
Yeah, with Europe and
fine
Canada.
With me. Yeah.
Fine
with me.
I thought on the populist right, there was this view that Biden was selling our interests out to Paris and France.
Yes.
Just as a note, this has nothing to do with France. That's just where the accord happened to take place.
There was a Ted Cruz tweet that was like, Pittsburgh greater than Paris, right? And,
there was a Lauren Boebert. I work for Pueblo, not Paris. Because she's from a congresswoman from Colorado.
Yeah, so that's obviously just kind of, I mean, it's not kind of, it's completely silly and ignorable, I suppose.
Biden also rejoined the World Health Organization.
Right.
I'm reasonably agnostic on that. I would say most epidemiologists and public health experts are favorable toward rejoining the World Health Organization.
I think the WHO obviously was craven in the face of Chinese pressure. And that's what a lot of conservatives were angry about, and maybe still are angry about. And they wanted to see a more forceful denunciation of the WHO's behavior at
Right.
minimum, and they didn't get that. So they're not happy about that. But again, it's something that I don't think people don't seem to care too much about.
Yeah, that's right. And then we have a set of executive orders that were directed at an issue that you're more passionate about than I am, but related to immigration. So ending the so-called Muslim ban,
Right.
halting construction on the border wall with Mexico, and then
Yep.
bolstering the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program.
Yeah,
What's
and
your feeling on those?
I don't like. I mean, the wall thing has turned into such a distorted symbol of debate instead of a realistic solution to the border problem. Now, if you look at the research, it does suggest that walls are really good ways of protecting borders, and that the wall, if you take it away from the sort of grandiosity of Trump's claims about it, increasing fencing on the border is a good idea in my view. And I think a lot of people who are restrictionists would contend that as well. So I don't like ending this for symbolic purposes. And you can see in the we don't have access to the Biden bill on his immigration bill, but we do have an outline of it. And in the outline, what they say they're going to do is move from the wall to other kinds of unspecified technologies. And
Right.
it did strike me that just seems to be symbolic. It's like, well, we can't do the wall, so we're just going to say we're going to use different kinds of technologies to enforce the border. I don't like that. I didn't like, though, how Trump turned it into a stupid symbol and made it vulnerable to this kind of demagoguery on the left by demagoguing it on the right, talking about this beautiful wall that Mexico would pay for. So that's unfortunate. Trump hurt the cause there, and and Biden's hurting the cause, as you would expect him to do. He's got an issue that he can demagogue, and he is. The deferred action, it was going to happen. I don't like it. I don't like DACA to begin with. I think it should have been thrown out. It was, in my view, clearly unconstitutional. I think many experts would agree with that, including Obama before he did it.
Yes.
But I'm not spitting fire about it because I knew it was coming. And I do think, as we'll get into when we talk about...
just how do we know that Obama thought it was unconstitutional?
Well, Obama himself said that it was unconstitutional,
and he
said
had
on a number of occasions, I can't do something about this. That's not how the Constitution works.
Right.
Basically.
So he had something of a infamous encounter where activists were heckling him, and he said, look, if I could just do this with a pen, I would, but I can't. Right. We have a constitution. And then he just ended up doing it anyway.
Right. And so the Supreme Court had a chance. They actually put a halt to Trump. The Trump administration tried to get rid of it altogether, right? The DACA program. The Supreme Court had a chance of consenting to that, but we don't need to get into it, but there's a lot of legalese, legal, in my view, sophistry that ended up kicking it back to the Trump administration. Now, the Trump administration, what the problem with the Trump administration, one of many problems, is that they were often lazy and sloppy. So they would do things, and then like the so-called Muslim ban, and they did it in such a haphazard and incompetent way that it was really easy for judges to rule against them or to protect a program that maybe the judges like or that liberals like on the basis of the incompetence of the Trump administration. So that happened a lot. And I think I don't like that judges were overreaching, but I think you can understand, given the probably hitherto unprecedented idiocy and incompetency of the Trump administration on a lot of these issues. Now, they did eventually get the so-called Muslim ban. They redid it and did a much better job of it. And eventually the Supreme Court, I believe it was a 5-4 decision.
But they didn't take another crack at DACA after that got sent back.
Okay. No,
Okay.
they didn't. That's right. But I mean, maybe they would have in the next 4 years. I don't think so. The thing on DACA, as we can discuss when we get into the immigration bill, is that I think that's something that a lot of conservatives would be willing to negotiate. I think a lot of conservatives are sympathetic to the so-called dreamers or children of people who came into the country and who have been here for over 5 years continuously through no fault of their own, through their parents' fault. Now, we can get into the morality of it, but nevertheless, I think people are pretty sympathetic with the so-called dreamers and so would be willing to make a deal about them.
Right.
The other ones, the Muslim one, I read a little bit on that, and back in the day I read on it. I think it was mostly symbolic. There probably are a few legitimate security concerns, but I think the actual resonance of the policy is there are a lot of people who are relatively nativist or who like the country as it is, and they don't want to see more Islamic influence here. And they view that as a way to at least put a pause on that, and that's why they like it. They don't really care about the underlying, not that they don't care, but they don't know about like the underlying security arguments, and that actually gets pretty complicated pretty quickly.
Okay, so as completely expected, the Biden administration also took away the Trump ban on CRT,
Yes.
critical race theory. That I'm kind of a meh. I don't have a strong. I mean, it's symbolic that the progressives are in power and that they're woke and they like critical race theory and racial sensitivity training. But this was obviously going to happen.
I mean, I think that aspects of the sensitivity training that the Trump administration pointed to and objected to, they were correct to object to.
Namely the anti-Americanism and the hatred toward whiteness.
And it's very clear that that is becoming more of a part of mainstream progressive, at least mainstream progressive discourse. And I loathe it. Yes, I don't know that the CRT executive order was the best way to deal with it. I'd have to really, I mean, there are also complicated legal issues. I mean, obviously, I would prefer to get rid of it, but I'd have to think carefully about the best way of fighting against it. And this executive order was utterly predictable, and it's not the end of the world in my opinion.
Right. And I think the legal route, like legal warfare, is probably the best route to go because it's not so attached to a particular administration. So you have Chris Rufo and a lot of other people who are going this legal route, and we can kind of see what happens there.
Right.
Also, as expected, the Biden administration shut down the 1776 commission, which was the Trump administration's like alternative to the 1619 project. I think that would be a fair way of describing it.
On this one, again, it's largely symbolic, of course, but when you add up enough symbols, you get something that matters, I think. So all of these things, it's like each one you can kind of be like, meh, whatever. But there is this clear cultural orientation of we won the election and we're going to mainstream this kind of progressivism. And that's that. And you're not going to stop it. And the 1776 project or commission, whatever, the pamphlet that they came out with, I mean, I saw people deriding it, ridiculing it, etc. I thought it was perfectly fine. I thought it was actually pretty good. I mean, much better than some of the extreme stuff in the 1619 articles. I mean, there were many good ones in that project in the New York Times, but some of the more extreme ones that captured people's attention and that school districts were starting to absorb into their curriculum are completely crazy. And the
Yes.
76 pamphlet, I think, was much more accurate a historical picture of the United States. And furthermore, as I maintain, some amount of education is going to be propagandistic, and that's perfectly fine. And if it's going to be propagandistic, which it inevitably is, then it should be propagandistic in a way that promotes nationalism and patriotism, love for country, and brings people together around the idea of America as a great shining city on a hill.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think the problem here is that, again, the Trump administration, rather than being politically deft, right, went with this kind of partisan commission. It's partisan in the sense that all of the people on it have right-wing conservative views and are well known for that, right?
Yes.
And so they write this document that's coming from a partisan, and that's fine, a partisan conservative perspective, but that, okay, well, then when a Democrat wins the election and has power, they're not going to instantiate that commission.
Yeah,
I think
sorry, go ahead.
So if you would have been a little bit more intelligent about it, I think you would have gotten centrist historians, like really well-respected historians that are respected on both sides of the political aisle, and you would have tried to come out with this centrist commission. Yes, it would have alienated progressives, of course, and people who are woke, and it probably would have alienated far-right conservatives, but it would be much harder to justify shutting it down.
Yeah, I mean, I would have tried, if I had done this, I would have tried to secure Gordon Wood, H.W. Brands, John Meacham, James McPherson,
like Joseph Ellis,
some of these people who are clearly liberal, some who are very just like politically neutral. You can't even tell what, like, I have no clue what their political views are, and I think they take pride in that. Gary Gallagher, other historians. That's what I would have done as well. But I would say the 1776 pamphlet is not conspicuously slanted, except for in a few areas that I do think were regrettable, because they provided obvious targets for leftists to snipe at. And one was this section on progressivism that condensed the entire progressive movement of, like, say, the 1880s to the 1920s into like 3 paragraphs that made it sound as though it was a total repudiation of the founding, a rejection of the notion of natural rights, an acceptance of the relativity and historicism of all truth, and an embrace of eugenics, right? All of this together, just, like a full embrace of the administrative state and like meddling bureaucrats, which of course is this particular conservatism's like bête noire, right?
That's the problem. These people, not only are they not reconciled to the New Deal, they're not even reconciled to Teddy Roosevelt.
Well, I think that's not exactly the way to put it. It's not that they're not reconciled to it, because some of these people, I would imagine, would support a lot of aspects of the New Deal. It's that they view, in my view, their historical narrative here is a bit tendentious, but they view the modern progressive identity politics movement as an almost natural outgrowth of progressivism in 1890 to 1920, right? Their enemy, their like real enemy is Woodrow Wilson.
Yes.
And they just despise some of these figures of progressivism, and they see modern identity politics and modern progressivism as a natural outgrowth, and therefore they deride the progressivism of the 1890s to 1920s or 80s, whenever you want to put the era. And I think they also massively misrepresent the progressive era, and it's totally unnecessary in this document. There's no need for this section. It actually it's kind of jarring in how, you know, incongruent it is with a lot of the other parts of the document. That's my view on it, and it was just an unforced error.
Yeah,
Not from their point of view, they probably liked that, right? We know some of the people who were on it, and clearly they wanted to make that point. But in my view, it's an unforced error.
yeah, I agree. But if you're going to lament the administrative regulatory state, that means that you're not reconciled to the New Deal because,
Well, that gets complicated.
well, I mean, let's say this, like it's pretty clear that most of the people on there, including some high-ranking members on the commission, are not fans of the New Deal,
Yeah,
and they
that's
view
fine,
it
but
as
they didn't explicitly denounce the New Deal in the document. They denounced progressivism and then communism, fascism, and then modern identity politics,
yeah, and
which
yes,
they traced back to John Calhoun.
yes, that's right, that's right.
Right. It's just this weird, like, trying to associate and smear modern progressives by relating, trying to associate them with John Calhoun's, like, pro-slavery racial identity politics that are totally different from modern racial identity politics. I just don't see the need for it. It's tendentious at best, completely mendacious at worst, and it makes it an easy, the pamphlet an easy target of derision. I will say, however, if you read the liberal mainstream media's
Yes.
account of the 1776 pamphlet and project in general, it is absolutely histrionic and ridiculous. I mean,
Yes, the New York Times article
Right.
was quite bad.
CNN was terrible. I mean, it said that the goal of the project was to stop a more accurate picture of slavery from being taught in schools. As if
Yes.
that was the point of the project, is we're against an accurate pedagogy on slavery. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and apparently some mainstream historians took umbrage that there weren't historians associated with the commission. Rather, they were mostly like political philosophers.
Yeah, I think that's fair. If you, the problem is a lot of the historians that I saw who were cited were younger, probably pretty progressive historians, right? If you had
Right.
cited like James McPherson and Gordon Wood saying this is terrible, or we wanted to be on it and they didn't allow us or something, then I would take that much more seriously.
Yeah, agreed.
Still,
So-
again, this is mostly a symbolic issue, but one that somewhat matters because you can see that this is related to a war, a culture war about the curriculum. And here, progressives are clearly signaling that they want to win this war, and there's not going to be a lot of compromise on it.
Yeah, that's right. And here you also have a confluence of interest then between the federal government and the Biden administration and the grassroots when we're talking about most teachers
Right.
and professors, right? Because
Right.
the younger generation just tends to be more woke.
Right.
So to fight against what's happening to the curriculum, the K through 12 curriculum or the college curriculum, is going to take a lot of effort, and it might be a futile effort.
Yes, unfortunately.
Futility is probably the word that I would use on that one.
Yeah, this may be the real lost cause that
Yeah.
could go down in history.
Yeah. Yes. So then we have these two remaining executive actions, probably the two that I saw that provoked the most discussion. So that is the executive order on combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation, and
Right.
putting the kibosh on the Keystone XL pipeline.
Let's do the Keystone one pretty quickly because the details get pretty complicated on that.
They sure
I think
do.
you'll agree.
Yes.
And much of the conversation, much of the debate about it is utterly histrionic, hyperbolic, and completely out of proportion with the actual effects of the Keystone XL one way or the other.
Well, let me just say, I think it is important for listeners that this is a pipeline that was proposed to be built that would run from the tar sands of Alberta and Canada, started in Hardisty, a small town in Alberta, down through Montana, South Dakota, and it would terminate in Nebraska, where it connects with another pipeline.
With the existing Keystone pipeline.
Right. So there's already one pipeline,
Right.
Obviously more than one, but there's one main pipeline that runs down from the tar sands all the way down to Texas. So this is just putting this proposed pipeline on that. And
it's a more direct route.
That's right. And I agree with you that most of the discussion about this is histrionic. Lots of Republicans saying this is going to cost 20,000, 30,000 jobs, well-paid union jobs. A lot of Democrats saying there's environmental crisis if we build this. I think,
or a rape of Native American land was like the other issue. Now, I think so. On the left, you really do have this quasi-religious environmentalism that turns the earth into Mother Nature and sees any attempt to get or extract resources from her as a rape.
So
it's the ideology they have, and you see this in people like Daryl Hannah, who was arrested protesting this and originally drew a lot of attention, or not originally, but when she did this, it drew a lot of attention to this. And you see it with people such as Mark Ruffalo, a famous famous actor who attacks fracking and other invasive ways of getting fossil fuels.
Right. So the Keystone XL pipeline itself is a condensed tribal symbol at this point.
Yes.
Right. And it's interesting because let's say that if you found out tomorrow, they didn't build the Keystone, but what they're going to do is they're going to transport all of that oil via trucks and trains anyway, and it's going to get across the border.
Right.
And it releases more carbon emissions if you do it that way. Nobody would even notice because they're so focused on this as just like this symbol of environmentalism versus, pro-growth, drill baby drill type attitude.
Well, this is where I think sacred values distort rational thinking about issues. And you see this, Barron wrote about this in one of the early articles on what I think he called it protected values, but what we would call sacred values, that it actually blinds people to trade-offs, and they're unwilling to make what would rationally be the better policy, the policy in their own interests in some way. So for example, if you're opposed to abortion, let's say that you discover it's a sacred value for you. Right. If you're told that supporting Planned Parenthood would actually reduce the number of abortions each year because more women would go there, they would get birth control, they would still get abortions, but there would be fewer of them.
Right.
A lot of people will still not accept that or approve of that, even though it will do sort of explicitly what they say they want, which is reducing the number of that. Similarly, a lot of people, a lot of environmentalists would probably, at least in practice, support policies that increase carbon emissions so long as they prevent this symbolic defeat for their cause.
I think that's absolutely correct. And kind of our Burkean conservative perspective would be it's always filled with tragic trade-offs, or at least trade-offs.
Almost all these kinds of debates have trade-offs that are really difficult.
So, and one conservative concern that I saw expressed that I just want to note is, and I saw this in Rich Lowry wrote an op-ed in the National Review, or NRO, National Review Online, about this, that it would have a deleterious effect on our relationship with Canada, because Canada, even the woke Trudeau, was favorable toward the pipeline because I think whatever the exact number, it would lead to more jobs, especially in areas that have been hit hard by globalization. And
I think TC, like what used to be Trans Canada.
Yes, that's right. And it helps some of these very poor rural areas in Alberta. So I just don't think that that's accurate. And so Trudeau came out with a comment. He said he was disappointed in the decision, but recognized that Biden was fulfilling a campaign promise. I'm sure that Biden and Trudeau will have a positive relationship, and maybe
Yeah.
they'll even figure out some compromise to get this bill, like, and maybe promote and invest in more green energy, or use this to get the oil company to make sure that it's carbon neutral. There's a lot that can still happen here, and this is not going to damage the relationship with Canada.
Yeah,
I don't
this
think
is
that's
going to
fair.
disrupt or sour relations between the U.S. and Canada. I agree.
That's right.
It seems to me like the judicious conclusion is that by 86ing it, you are costing immediate jobs that would be
Yes.
reasonably high paying, and there seems to be little environmental gain from it. Now, the long-term consequences aren't very clear either.
Right.
But my view is there's not a lot of reason not to support it. And I'm a fan of cheap energy. It helps, especially working class and poorer people. So
Yes.
I'm about increasing energy of all kinds as much as possible.
Yes. And I think that's important. And also, I think approving the pipeline would help Biden show that he's dedicated to unity, because where the
Right.
jobs would be created are in South Dakota and Montana
Right.
and Nebraska and Kansas. So states that are deep red states, mostly rural, economically depressed, uh, voters who typically wouldn't vote for the Democrat, and you could easily win some goodwill from them by
Yes.
approving of this, instead of just kind of going with the blue
Just
coast base.
capitulating to the environmental, like the religious environmentalism on the left.
That's right. And although this pipeline in and of itself is not particularly important in terms of jobs, it's there are other pipelines like Dakota Access that the Biden administration will have a perhaps determinative say on. And this kind of signals they're going to side against fossil fuels in the extractive industry.
I guess the
I
thing to
think.
say with these states is that they need to get more electoral college votes, and they need to be closer to a swing state because then it's harder to 86 a project. So
Yeah.
remember, I think Harris and Biden both were pretty hostile to fracking until later, when it was like, Pennsylvania is really a necessary, or it could be the necessary state, and we don't want to alienate fracking interest in Pennsylvania.
I think probably people in North and South Dakota and Montana should just learn to code. That's my proposed
Agreed.
solution.
A very wise solution. I agree.
So now we get to the ugly. This is the executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. The key passage of this, in my view, is children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports. And we will not discriminate on the basis not just of sex, but gender identity.
Right. So that's the important thing. Is this is also building off of the Bostock case, which we don't need to get into the weeds on Bostock, but the Bostock decision essentially said that Title VII of the Civil Rights Bill that was about sex discrimination also was about sex identity and sexual orientation discrimination, because those two were inextricably linked to sex.
Mhm.
And Gorsuch, who was Roberts signed on to the decision, but I think most observers think that the decision was led by Gorsuch, and clearly the people who argued the case tailored it directly to Gorsuch's textualism. Gorsuch justified this on a textualist reading, and admitted probably the people who enacted the bill did not intend for it to cover sexual orientation or identity,
Right.
but that a textualist reading leads to that inescapably.
Okay.
And so this executive order builds off of that, because Bostock was quite limited, you would say. It didn't cover bathrooms or sports, for example.
Mhm.
This now says you have to, essentially what it says, right? It's not 100% clear, but it seems to be saying, right? You have to allow sexual identity is now the same thing as sex.
No, gender identity. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, gender identity, sex, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you identify as a woman, you're a woman.
Yes.
And any treatment of you different from treatment of a woman is ipso facto discrimination.
Right. So this is basically this says biology is irrelevant. What
Correct.
matters is how do you personally identify, period.
Right.
Yes.
So in many ways, this is the obliteration of biology and the apotheosis of psychology.
Yeah.
Whatever you identify is true for purposes of these laws and norms, and we're going to defer to that. Now,
And so I think in everyday life and in many circumstances, who cares, right? Like if you identify as a man or a woman, it doesn't matter. But there are some domains where it really does matter, because
right.
there are sex differences. And I think those domains, I think the locker room is one where you can see that actually matters.
Yeah.
And school sports is one where it certainly matters. Right.
And things that people don't think about, like say
prisons
or shelters for
yes.
battered women.
Yeah, women's
do
shelters.
You have to allow if a man says I identify as a woman, do you have to allow that man into the shelter, battered shelter or shelter for battered women?
Right.
I think
right.
most of us sort of cringe at that and think there's something wrong about it. Or a lot of us do, at least.
The normies among us, right, are
yes.
not favorable toward that idea.
Right. So this is a triumph of what we might call I don't know what you want to call it, trans ideology or gender identity ideology. This ideology that sex is whatever people make of it. Biology is essentially irrelevant.
Yes.
And if you're not on board with this, what I would consider obliteration of science, then too bad.
Although interesting that these are the same people who would argue that race actually is not at all biological. But at the same time,
I know
if you tried to identify as a race other than your actual genetic / biological race, you will be punished by progressives. If you don't think that's true, look up the Rachel Dolezal case.
Right, they will excoriate transracialism.
Yeah, transracialism.
Even though they argue that that's socially constructed.
Right. So
if I say I identify as Black and people treat me as Black, and that's how I want to be recognized in the world.
Right.
I also now want the affirmative action programs that benefit my fellow Black
all
people.
Of the scholarships.
I should get that. Yeah. They would be very irritated by that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this has alarmed a lot of people. I've gotten actually a few texts from very liberal individuals who were concerned about it. And I think that concern is justified because with colleges and universities, because they're dependent on federal funding, they tend to not only adhere to these, but to go out of their way so they're not perceived as deviating at all. And we saw this with the Dear Colleague letter from the Obama administration. Right. All of these colleges, even small, like the college I worked at, Carroll College in Montana, they scrambled to put in place these Title IX regulations so that they could be guaranteed federal funding. So this is a powerful executive order. It's unclear exactly how it will be interpreted legally, but I think people are absolutely right to be concerned about it.
Yeah, because if it's taken straightforwardly, it means that all colleges that are public now have to allow trans people
Mhm.
to play women's sports. And that means that if you're a private university and you're competing against these universities and
Yes.
they have trans women, i.e., biological men, playing on their teams, you're at a competitive disadvantage if you don't allow it, depending on how many people start to enter these leagues, right?
Yes.
So I
Now,
actually think the worst thing for this trans ideology, for the proponents of it, the worst thing that could happen is that, say, 1% of athletes in women's sports, especially prominent sports such as basketball, volleyball, are trans women or biological men, and they start to dominate the leagues, because I
yes.
think people will be outraged by that.
Yeah, I agree. Now, in the for kind of a nuanced perspective here, it's worth noting that currently 16 states already have what are known as trans-friendly laws in
Mhm,
place,
mhm.
and they still have women's college sports. So the idea that it's going to like immediately destroy women's sports, that's going too far. There are 14 states that have rules that trans athletes can participate in sports, but they require medical proof or some kind of disclosures.
Mhm.
10 states don't have any guidance, and then this is according to trans athletes, so it's obviously take it with somewhat of a grain of salt, but they say 11 states have discriminatory policies, right?
Also known as what women's sports were made for, namely discriminating against biological men so that women could have a domain in which they could compete. So,
Yes. So I guess they're for now, I think the effects of this will be relatively minimal for now, right? Because we already have these 16 states that have these policies,
mhm,
and it hasn't had that deleterious of an effect. Now, I know there's a suit, or there was in Connecticut, trying
yes.
to overthrow their trans friendly law. But I think the problem here is not that it will have this immediate effect of destroying women's sports, but rather that over the medium term, it, with shifting cultural norms and values, that you
Right.
could see this erosion of women's sports, right? The
It's
competitiveness and the fairness there.
right. You can watch in horror as this ideology encroaches further and further upon things that it once proclaimed it would leave alone. So
Mhm.
I mean, we can remember in like 2015 and 16 during the great bathroom debates, right?
Yeah.
This is when people were worried about, you know, should we allow trans women to go into women's bathrooms? And a lot of the talk from the sort of trans ideology side, and I think I don't want to call it that, because I think you can respect trans people without buying into this ideology. So this more, we'll just call it progressive ideology.
Mhm.
A lot of the proponents of this progressive ideology would criticize people who said, well, wait a second, this is going to have all of these downstream consequences. They would say, oh, you're just disguising your bigotry. It's not going to do
Slippery slope
anything.
fallacy.
Yeah. And here we are. And there are men dominating in some local area women's sports. There's an MMA fighter who has injured other MMA fighters. There are just, no, I agree. It's women's sports hasn't been obliterated or destroyed or annihilated yet, but the march of this progressive ideology could lead us to a place where it's much harder to have female friendly places and places and policies, etc. And I know a lot of women, or a lot is an overstatement, but I know progressive women or very leftist women who find this appalling.
Right.
And they say, it's appropriating womanhood in some sense, in the way that, you would say somebody who's transracial is appropriating a race. and they don't like it. They think it's actually anti-feminist. And of course, we have the term now TERF, which is
Right.
what, trans exclusionary radical feminist,
Yes.
which really should just refer to people who are feminists who are worried about the effects of this ideology on feminism,
Yeah.
including J.K. Rowling, for example.
Agreed. And my view is the best way to deal with this fraught issue is at the state and local level. Right? I mean, there's probably no perfect solution. It's difficult, but why not allow, if you have a state that has, more traditional values such as Idaho, allow them to instantiate those values and their best practices and rules and regulations about how trans athletes in sports. And if Washington State has a different set of values that they want to put into practice, okay, maybe I disagree with that, but let them do it locally as possible, right?
Yeah, and I mean, let's point out how great of an usurpation of power this really is, because what this is saying is, if you are a state, if you're Idaho or Montana, and you
Yes.
want to make a law that bans biological men from playing women's sports, you can't anymore.
That's right.
And how you can claim that that kind of a law would somehow violate the Constitution is beyond me.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the claim, as the document, the EO says, these principles are reflected in the Constitution.
Right, and it also not only does it take it out of the hands of states and localities, it also takes it out of the hands of governing bodies that presumably have a lot of information about the best way to implement these fraught issues, like the NCAA, for example. Now they just have NCAA is just going to say, okay, well, we have to follow the guidance from the federal government now.
And by the way, this is what I think the Bostock decision, although an earnest decision for Gorsuch, I'm not accusing him of bad faith. I think it was a terrible decision. And I think this was also one of the very predictable consequences of that decision. This will probably somehow, in some way, shape, or form, end up in the Supreme Court, I would guess.
Yes.
They're going to have to make a decision about bathrooms and sports, etc.
Right.
And I actually don't know how a Gorsuch or a Roberts would vote. I mean, I think you're going to get the progressives or the liberals, the left judges in a block voting for this. So it's going to come down to Roberts and Gorsuch again.
Right.
And I worry that the logic of Bostock almost leads to this, almost inevitably. I mean, they attempted to make these fine distinctions, and maybe they will figure out a way to use those distinctions, because I don't think Gorsuch would like this. I don't think he'd like this as a consequence of the Bostock decision, but it's going to be hard to somehow distinguish that from this.
Yes. Agree.
And also, this is another example of flipping the bird to conservatives while proclaiming a fidelity to the idea of unity, right?
Yeah, and
because this is very divisive,
right? And that's so you have some of these executive orders, if you look at the kind of basket of them, that are redistributionist or economically helpful for low SES groups or people who have been harmed by the pandemic. Those, I think, you generally have bipartisan support, at least currently. I don't even think Mitch McConnell's like, let's take away SNAP benefits, right?
Put up resistance.
But other than that, yeah, you take the rest of these together, and it's just hardcore progressivism, right?
Yeah,
let's undo everything Trump did on immigration, get rid of the CRT ban, axe the 1776 commission,
right?
So we'll see what
it's a fist bump to the progressive base in a middle finger to conservatives.
Now, to be clear, I think it is fair if you're a Democratic president and you win to throw your coalition some goodies and even some symbolic
Sure. Yeah.
things that they can be happy about. But I think
Right.
this goes a little bit far, and in my view,
Well, yeah, I agree. And what it illustrates, I think, and what we see, we can transition to talking about the legislative agenda as evidenced by the immigration bill, for
Mhm.
example. I think what this illustrates is that actually the Biden administration is going to be radical on issues of race, gender, sexuality, and then moderate or more centrist on economic stuff, right? That's basically the sense that you get here.
Uh, I'm going to diverge a little bit. I actually think they're quite to the left on economic issues. And let's get into the American Rescue Plan, where I think this is in evidence. So the American Rescue Plan is the first proposed round of stimulus for tackling the pandemic. So previous to this, we've had the CARES Act, which was passed, and that had about 2 trillion in spending. And then you had the House passed the HEROES Act, which I think called for about 3.5 trillion. That was not passed by the Senate. The Senate then passed a bill that actually it just doesn't even have a name. It was just some stopgap measure in December.
Mm-hmm.
And the American Rescue Plan, if you look at what was passed in December and you subtract it from the HEROES Act that was passed in the House, you roughly get this, right? So this is proposed to be 1.9 trillion in spending. The kind of key components of it are a proposed $1,400 stimulus check, which would go to everybody under a certain income bracket.
Right,
So,
which adds that up to 2,000, which was
right,
the proposal a lot of people like. Now,
Mhm.
including Hawley and Rubio. And the reason
Yeah.
I say centrist is because I think the economic philosophy has shifted to the left in the country in general, because you do have populist conservatives in the Senate now, and you did have Trump, who dissented from orthodoxy in his own wild way, and therefore this is not as alienating to conservatives as, say, the immigration bill is. This is something you could actually negotiate. You might not get the 1.9 trillion, but there are things in here that you can definitely negotiate, right?
That's fair. But I think people need to harken back to Obama and remember that his stimulus that he passed was
Yes.
like 900 billion.
Yeah, he
And
didn't dare touch a trillion.
that's right. And during the Obama administration, after the stimulus, there was a lot of austerity and there were a lot of deficit hawks
Yes.
in the Obama administration, and actually kind of mainstream neoliberal Democrats who were seriously concerned about deficits. So
don't you think you could call that the Obama era like the last exhausted yawn of the sort of budget hawk?
unless Mitch Daniels is viable in 2024, then I would say yes.
I mean, there are people who will make fiscal arguments, Rand Paul, probably Ted Cruz, etc. But that kind of budget hawkishness is just not mainstream anymore. You
Yes.
really
So
can't bludgeon your opponents by pointing to their profligacy anymore.
that's right. So to be clear, we have a demand gap in the economy from the pandemic. That's
Yes.
obviously the case. Jobless claims are increasing. The CARES Act, I give a lot of credit to. That did a lot of good for American families, and the December stopgap has done a lot of good. But any mainstream economist who looks at this has said the American Rescue Plan, that stimulus, that goes beyond the demand shortfall that we have in our economy. So the fact that you can propose this, and yeah, you get Mitt Romney saying, I don't think we're going to pass that, but nobody loses their mind. Yeah,
that's right.
that is quite impressive.
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
So you've got the $1,400 stimulus, the extension of the supplement to unemployment insurance. So they want to give an additional $400. Currently, that number is the December bill made that a $300 supplement to unemployment. So they would increase that by 100 and then extend it from mid-March all the way through September. 170 billion for school reopening, 440 billion to local communities. Now, this really mostly amounts to that 440 billion, mostly amounts to a quote unquote state bailout because states are going to have budget shortfalls that they need to make up because unlike the federal government, states need to run balanced budgets. And as this fiscal year ends, they're going to be deep into the red. But they didn't want to say state bailout or anything.
Well, some
because
senators had called it a blue state bailout, and so there was this
Illinois and California,
that democratically run states were profligate in their spending, and now we're getting bailed out. And that's a complicated issue, but that's a simplistic view of things, at least.
Yes. So they also have an expanded child care tax credit proposal. A lot of other goodies in it. I think the other main proposal in there is this desire to increase the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 per hour.
Yeah, this is going to be a sticking point, I think, clearly.
Yes.
So whereas I think you'll be able to get a decent amount of bipartisan support for some of this. The $15 federal minimum wage, first of all, it's only tenuously related to the pandemic at best.
That's right.
Second, it's awfully high, especially when you look at low cost of living states such as Louisiana or Arkansas or Mississippi. It would put a lot of stress on businesses there.
It's a big jump in the minimum wage. I mean, currently there are only 5 states that have minimum wages that are greater than or equal to $12.50.
Yeah.
So this is quite a hike. There's no doubt about it.
I think the important thing with this whole package is that it reminds me of normal politics. We can debate these things. There are some Republican senators, members of the House, of course, senators, though, focused on who will support some of these things and who wanted some of these things. And you can really get a Rubio, a Hawley, maybe a Cotton, maybe a Toomey, maybe some other people on some of these issues. The child credit, you can get a Mike Lee, for example, some Reformicon influence. You are not going to get agreement on all of these things. It might get squashed. It's going to get transformed, whatever. But it's at least a policy that I don't see this as like an anti-unity policy at all. It's a perfectly reasonable proposal for a winning coalition to make, to say we want some of our interest taken care of, and we're going to try to have a debate about this and get this policy through.
Yes.
That's unlike the immigration bill. The immigration bill that Biden forwarded, it went further. I think it was more radical than people thought it would be. And it proposes there are lots of details in it. We don't have to talk about all of those details because they get sort of complicated in the weeds about enforcement and, remain in Mexico policy. The centerpiece of this, though, is a path to citizenship in 8 years for 11 million illegal immigrants. Right now, the original Gang of 8 bill, if listeners will recall, was the 2013 failed attempt at bipartisan reform, and I think which Rubio infamously was a member of,
yes,
and could really never escape. Lindsey Graham as well.
Rubio is really the public face of the Gang of 8.
Right, because Rubio made
the talk show rounds.
Yes, Marco Rubio made the calculation that the 2012 autopsy, or the 2012-13 autopsy, that suggested that conservatives needed to get more Hispanic voters was the way to go, and that he would be the face of the new GOP. So he went with this immigration compromise bill that ended up getting crushed in the House. And he didn't do very good on when he made the rounds on the talk shows. Although I think Hannity supported it
Briefly, yes.
tepidly and briefly until
He
it was
even
clear.
made a pretty persuasive case and convinced Limbaugh, at
Okay,
least for a
yes.
few minutes,
Yeah,
that it
that's
was a
right.
good idea.
Yeah. So that bill would have offered a path to citizenship in 13 years.
Mhm.
So it was a longer period. Both of these are haunted by the 86 immigration bill that was passed by Reagan that amnestied somewhere around 3 million illegal immigrants, because conservatives thought that was like the final immigration deal, compromise. Okay, we do the amnesty, we grant citizenship down the road, and at least we get legal status. In return, we crack down at the border, we crack down on employers who are hiring illegal immigrants, etc.
So some form of e-verify,
Well,
or
if you look at the law, it had punishments in there for these employers, but as the research indicates, they were completely futile to the task that they had. And so they probably sort of a tacit agreement with capital, like, yeah, keep on doing this.
right.
So the bill was a catastrophic failure in the sense that it did not increase enforcement. In fact, that population was replenished very quickly with illegal immigrants. And now the estimates are somewhere around 11 million, probably more than that, though. So conservatives are, and I think the conservative base, they don't remember maybe the Reagan policy, but they just don't like the immigration. They see a system that's broken, and they see the massive demographic change that has happened since the 70s, especially, and they don't like it. And so this is, in my view, a non-starter. It is completely fantastical. The bill offers really nothing to conservatives. It makes vague intimations about enforcement with new technology and giving more money to countries in Latin America to solve the source problem, to make the countries better so that people won't want to flee them. Now, the chances that actually works are very low. And in fact, the immediate effect of sending money to those countries might be to increase emigration from them, immigration in the United States. So at any rate, the immigration bill, it reminds me of why I was at least somewhat sympathetic to Trumpism while not liking Trump at all, because I care about demographic change a lot, and I care about slowing it down and being more judicious and conservative about it. And this Biden bill is like my worst nightmare. Now, I knew something was coming, obviously, even when I supported Biden with the painfully, knew that would mean I wouldn't get what I wanted on immigration, but this is definitely not what I want. And also, with these executive orders and this bill and the rhetoric that's being put out into the world, it's very clear that the Biden administration is not going to concern itself with interior enforcement unless the person who's illegal here commits a serious crime.
Correct.
And that allows, when the asylum system and the court, the hearings, etc., when that ramps back up after the pandemic calms down, that will make it easier for people to flee into the interior and just disappear into the population.
Right.
So these are all things that people who are concerned about immigration and want more restrictionist policies are very concerned about, disconcerted by. Now, this bill has no chance of passing, but it doesn't even, it's just irritating because, look, I get Biden won, and they're going to try to do what they're going to try to do, but it doesn't even offer anything to conservatives. It's just not even a serious, like, first round, good faith, here's something we're going to offer you. Like if we just focused on dreamers, I think we could get somewhere.
Right.
Here, give e-verify and, concrete wall, plan for walls or fences on the border. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the interior enforcement plan. In return, some kind of legal status plus even citizenship down the road for dreamers. I would be amenable to that. And I think other people would as well. But this is just a non-starter.
So as an important kind of note of political logistics, we'll note the Democrats have the Senate, right? Well, it's 50-50, but Harris is the tiebreaker.
Yeah.
So in order to pass an immigration bill, you need to have a filibuster proof majority. Just as a note, though, on a lot of the policies those that involve taxing and spending that have a budgetary effect, short-term budgetary effect, you can pass those through, we don't have to get into the weeds, but something known as the reconciliation process.
Right.
And that requires only a simple majority.
Right. And I was going to say on the immigration, it depends upon how creative Democrats want to get, and do they want to make some of the immigration stuff somehow budgetary?
Right.
Because there's a lot of like legislative chicanery that can happen here, and you can make it somehow relevant to the budget, and then you can try to pass it through reconciliation. Now, I don't think that the Democrats would want to fuck around with the immigration one on this, because that will cause, sure as the sun will rise tomorrow, that will cause a immediate and violent backlash. In 2022, Democrats would get hammered in the midterms.
Yeah, I agree with that. Where they might want to get creative would be on something such as the minimum wage, right? Moving that to 15. So it's unclear whether you could do that through reconciliation. And following the Byrd rule. But one thing I think Matt Iglesias noted this, rather than doing the minimum wage, what you could do is put in place a 100% employer payroll tax on all businesses that weren't paying $15 an hour.
Right.
Now, again, whether the Senate, whether they would actually try to do that is unclear. But this is to say that the reconciliation process is basically now it's just a way to get around the filibuster, and administrations are becoming more and more creative about how you can pass things through reconciliation.
I think the thing, though, again, with the difference between say even a $15 minimum wage and the immigration thing, is that the immigration thing is direct and immediately offensive to Trump voters. $15 minimum wage isn't so offensive to some of them, right?
No,
I mean, I've watched interviews.
In fact, right, like in Florida, where Biden lost, they passed a $15 minimum wage.
Right. So that's something that it just won't cause the same kind of backlash that the immigration will.
Yes.
And
the
I think
$15 minimum wage is more popular than Democratic politicians.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess this is a good transition, though, into populism and Trumpism without Trump.
Before that, briefly, Biden does have a COVID plan. Not going to get into the details. Basically wants to set up more sites, mobilize the full resources of the government. And in the American Rescue Plan, there's an additional $160 billion that he wants to spend on the COVID directly on the COVID pandemic.
I'm all for that. So
we'll just mention that. I don't think that's going to be very controversial.
Yeah,
most of it at least.
Yes. So then we can move into Trumpism without Trump, or this Michael Brendan Doherty article about, which is really basically, is there a future for populism in the United States? And so let me forward my hypothesis that can kind of frame this discussion. I think my hypothesis is that populism in the West is mostly a response to rapid demographic change. And that's like the biggest issue of concern to the voters. And of course, the biggest cause of rapid demographic change is mass migration.
Mhm.
And the reason that it tends to manifest as populism is because both mainstream parties in the United States and then mainstream parties in Europe had an agreement among themselves that immigration was good, largely good, and that they were going to allow it to happen. And so concern with immigration, immigration restrictionism, and demographic change is intrinsically anti-elitist because it's against the elite consensus, and that's why it ends up manifesting as populism, which is a form of anti-elitism, a form of disgust with the current like status quo on some issue or another. So that's my thesis.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think the research supports that. I would say it's more broadly an anxiety toward rapid cultural change, of which demographic
Yes.
change is a particularly salient example.
Yeah, that's probably true, and like you might even you might expand that to an anxiety with the effects of increasing globalization, because mass migration and increasing cultural change that's not directly related to mass migration, both of those are largely caused by increasing globalization.
Yeah, so there's a real skepticism toward the elite-led global project, let's
Right,
say.
and that's the important thing, is because this was a consensus from Bill Clinton and Larry Summers in the Democratic Party to G.W. Bush and thinkers in the Republican Party.
That's right. There's been a bipartisan consensus on immigration,
Yeah.
on free trade, right,
Yes.
and opening financial markets,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So uh, populism can be seen as a backlash against all of those facets of globalization. And again, I think that the reason it often manifests as what would be viewed as kind of xenophobia or quote unquote like racism is because demographic change is maybe the most salient,
Yes,
right,
it's very in your face.
indicator of.
And let me give an example. These numbers won't be exactly right, but they're close to correct. The white share of the population in the United States in 1965 was roughly 84%.
Mm,
In 2015, it was roughly 62%. And in 2065, the projection is that it will be somewhere around 46%. So you're talking about over a 20% decline in the relative population of whites from 2065 to 2015. So in a 50-year period, let me do my math. No, is that a 50-year period? You're talking about a 20% decline. That's massive. That is a huge decline in the share of the white population, and a huge increase in the share, of course, of the non-white population. That is very conspicuous. And it's interesting. I do this just to get a sense of what this would feel like. So if you watch programs from the 60s with an audience or something, or from the early 70s, it's almost all white. And it's actually jarring to see now because we're just not used to seeing a crowd like that. So this is a very visible effect of globalization. And yeah, I think, there are all kinds of reasons people are alienated by it, which are difficult to separate sometimes. But I
right.
think that is one of the major causes of populism, which is why I think that Brendan Doherty's thesis that populism will be around after Trump is correct,
Yes, I
because those
agree.
forces aren't going away,
Yeah,
right?
I agree 100% with the thesis that populism is not going anywhere, right? There's been an increase in populism across the developed world. It's not limited to the United States. It is a global phenomenon, and it's largely because a lot of nations are facing the same issues, right?
Right.
And so my question is not whether there's populism after Trump. There's inevitably going to be. It's what populism looks like after
Right.
Trump.
Right.
And I think Doherty's view, I mean, he's not explicit about this, but I think his view is that populism will remain, but who takes the mantle of populism, it's unclear. He doesn't even really speculate about what it would look like, except for, having more of these kind of nationalist policies, using
Right.
tariffs, being against free trade deals, uh, being right wing or restrictionist on immigration.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Doherty, in his most recent piece in the actual National Review magazine, wrote against the Republican Civil War. So you can see what Doherty wants is somehow to synthesize these forces without a crack up of the Republican
That
Party.
is synthesize the more traditional establishment Reagan wing and the
Right.
populist impulse.
Right. Without sacrificing all of the populist impulse, of course, because Doherty is more sympathetic to populism than most of the other people at the National Review, for example. And so I think you would, the major question in debate, I think, is it going to be a kind of performative populism, which would be the kind of populism that is practiced often by Hawley, but especially almost invariably by figures such as Marjorie Greene and Lauren Boebert.
Who's already, Green has already introduced articles of impeachment for Biden.
Yes, yes. And some of these figures who I mean, Ted Cruz, really, they're just, it's mostly a performance.
Nobody buys Ted Cruz as a real populist.
Right. It's basically just flipping the bird to the norms of the elites, and the very act of the violation of the norm is the whole point of the effort. There's no carefully calculated policy program. There's no commitment to an ideology, right?
In my view is at least tentatively that it's most likely that it'll be some form of boorish culture war performative populism for a few reasons. First,
well, wait, what's the alternative would be like a real policy-based ideological populism, right?
Yeah, what I've called lunch pail populism, more of a return to the kind of Nixonian Republican Party that was truly concerned with winning over the working class.
Right.
So this performative populism that's Trumpy, not just in its policy proposals, but also in its attitude, I think is likely, at least in the near future, to be the form of populism that will be in the ascendant. And I think, again, for a few reasons. So one, as you noted, populism, it tends to be anti-elitism. Or anti-elitist. So one way that you demarcate yourself from the elite, if you're a politician, is you act crass and boorish and you engage in irresponsible rhetoric, thereby demonstrating your affinity for the people, right?
Right.
We also have the fact that the last 4 years, and especially the last 3 or 4 months, Trump has really radicalized conservative populist voters, right? Mm-hmm. Who are largely unmoored and deracinated from institutions, right? So they've been radicalized on these real identity issues that are salient to them. Mm-hmm. In addition, it's not just that Trump has radicalized voters, he's also radicalized a large swath of the right-wing media ecosphere, right? Leading to Fox going somewhat Trumpy with figures such as Tucker Carlson. Then you have OAN, Newsmax, Breitbart, etc.
Right.
Also, I think it's easier to do performative populism. So you're giving voters, these kind of atomized voters who feel alienated, exactly what they want, right? You're shooting it straight into their veins. Right. And it doesn't require the difficulty that you face when you actually try to craft good policy or legislation, right? So I think for all of those reasons, anyone who tried to be a responsible Nixonian populist would get outflanked by a performative populist politically.
Right. So
even though I lament that, obviously.
Yeah. So therein lies the challenge, right? Because performative populism is very popular
Yes.
among the Trump base because it's an immediately satisfying display. You
Yes.
consume it and you're like, yeah, I fucking hate Colin Kaepernick. You're right. That son of a bitch should stand for the anthem or whatever.
Right.
Whatever it is. And it feels good that somebody's taking on these snobbish elites. And
that's right.
Merely watching somebody wreck their fine porcelain is very gratifying. The problem is, of course, that's not actually satisfying in the long run. Everybody's kind of poorer for it. And what you actually want is a serious figure who's able to somehow sort of sublimate those impulses into an actual populist program that actually becomes not populist in the sense that you create the appropriate institutions, and those institutions are led by elites that can then enact these policies and these cultural and can win these cultural battles. That's what I want to see. That's hard though, right?
Right. Yes,
you're
it's
right.
very difficult.
The problem is if you're in a campaign and you're putting out these carefully thought out policy programs and talking about the more fine nuances of the ideology, and your opponent is just breaking stuff and laughing at elites and doing the things that are immediately rewarding,
attacking people as globalists,
exactly,
the far left,
the stupid
woke
cosmopolitans.
Yeah,
it's going to be hard to defeat that person.
And one way you can see this, I think, in the figure of Marco Rubio, who I think is most talented and well positioned to occupy this kind of synthetic populism. But you can see that every other day he feels the need to do gratuitous culture warring on Twitter, because I think he understands this, and he's legitimately concerned that somebody's going to outflank him on the performative side and out culture war him. And he recognizes that he can't allow that to happen if he's going to be viable in 2023 and 2024.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the problem with Rubio, though, and the reason that last time we discussed this, I bet on Tom Cotton, is because Rubio seems like a phony. It seems like a veneer that is very thin, disguising this kind of hyper ambitious, educated, pretty straightforward elitist, right? Whereas it doesn't seem that way with Cotton. I think Cotton is the potential populist who could also unite more ordinary Republicans, who seems the most sincere about it. That's not to say that he's not sometimes behaving cynically. He's a politician after all. But it does mean that it wears more like familiar clothes on him than it does on these hyper-educated elite types like Hawley. I mean, Cotton's hyper-educated too, but he just, his characterologically, it just seems more like a part of his natural disposition than it does Josh Hawley's or Marco Rubio's disposition.
Yeah, agreed. But I think the problem is, if we're talking about direct democracy and giving voters what they want, for millions of these, kind of aggrieved, deracinated voters, performative populism is what they want, right? That's actually
what they want in the immediate,
and so what
you might want to watch a bad movie and eat Doritos.
That's right.
Yeah,
exactly. So I think that in order to have a more responsible, pluralistic type populism that accepts that there are legitimate political differences, there are multiple political parties, etc., you are really going to have to do the hard work of building up mediating institutions and organizations that can suppress the desire for immediate gratification and direct those interests to long-term projects, right?
Well,
As just as a note, as we've seen, like unions do an incredibly good job of that, as we previously mentioned. I think churches also, not all of them, but many churches do a good job also of doing that, right?
Right. So what's important in the institution is not necessarily that it transforms the desires of everyday people, but rather that it suppresses the ability of political players to play the short-term game, right? The institution puts a check on that. So it discourages people from playing the game of the demagogue.
Well, I think
that's what institutions are good at doing.
I think you can go at it both from the supply side and the demand side.
That's fair.
Right, because you can imagine, like, similar to, like, should I have a bag of Doritos tonight, right? Well, it's nice to cut off the supply and say, look, like, if you do this excessive culture war performative populism, you will get punished.
Right.
But it's also nice to have these voters like, yeah, I'd like to have that bag of culture war Doritos, but I know, like, it's in my long-term interest to have some economic carrots, right?
That's the important thing about institutions in general, is that individuals are stupid, individuals are selfish, individuals are short-sighted. That's just the nature of being a human individual. And in fact, these should be fundamental principles of conservatism, right?
They're manifestly obvious.
Right. And conservatism starts from the principle that humans are these frail, fallible creatures. The important thing is that you can create institutions that have more wisdom and that dissuade people from acting on their worst impulses. And the problem with populism right now, and actually kind of by its very nature, is that it disdains these kinds of institutions. It doesn't have them, and it sort of flips the bird to the elites who would head these institutions.
Right, because it really emphasizes this charismatic, direct connection between the populist leader and the voter.
Right, and this is why I actually dislike populism, even though I like a lot of the policy, like the sort of policy tendencies of modern populists. Because
it's not at all conservative, right? To pretend to act as though this leader, like Trump or whoever it would be, or Boebert, has some unique insight into the will of the people that they can determine that other people can't, because, guess what? There isn't a general will of the people, right?
Yeah, right.
It's just I don't like that. It's a problem.
I don't like it either. You're right. I mean, populism tends to devolve into a charismatic strongman. It to the extent there's not even really an ideology. There's a charismatic strongman who leads a populist movement. There's a Hugo Chavez, there's a Trump, there's an Orban, etc. Now, a lot of the grievances they're getting at are real and should be addressed.
Absolutely.
They're doing it in a particularly pernicious way.
Yes.
And what we need to do then, and I would just say, like, this is my view going from Doherty, and I think Doherty would be simpatico with this. We need to take the concerns that are addressed by populists and transform that into an institutional movement that is not populist. That is to say, that is not anti-elitist, because it has its own elites that it defers to, because every good movement, everything needs elites who run it in some sense. I mean, you need the talented people to be in charge of whatever movement it is, whatever you're doing, whether it's fixing a car or leading a political movement. It's good to have talented people at the top. Now, it should be meritocratic and it should defer to people. It shouldn't spit in the face of ordinary people. But it is just good to have elites disciplining these things. So that's my view, is we need to create an institutional structure that will encourage a much more salubrious long-term vision, long-term solution to the problems that ail the West, rather than this immediate and rather boorish populism.
Right, but I agree with that. What troubles me is that a lot of people who are sympathetic to populism have this view that the culture war stuff is just kind of a facade, and what the voters really want, or these citizens really want, is left-wing economic policies, right? Like, some people who are sympathetic to populism try to make it more of this class-based, because that seems a little bit less, divisive or kind of negative. And
you mean that they pretend it's about economic issues rather than demographic issues, I think, is the way to put it, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's a much more concise way of putting what I was going to say. They do it
with immigration too. Instead of accepting and admitting that the reason people are off put by too much immigration is because it changes the demographic characteristics of the country. They pretend it's about lowered wages among the lowest skilled workers.
Right.
And the reason, I think it's important to note, the reason is because these topics are so taboo.
That's right.
That you can't have the real topic, because if somebody said, I want the country to be more white in the future than the current trajectory is, that would be called racist.
Or even or I want the country, I want more Christians in the country.
Right. I want the country to be 50% white and more Christian because I like that. Yes. That's
although it's interesting.
People, that's ipso facto racist and bigoted.
Look at the atrocious double standard there. If you said, I want this nation to be much, much more ethnically diverse and atheist, nobody would care.
Fine.
In fact, that would be lauded. Right.
Diversity. You want fewer white people. Good for you.
And of course, it's good that there are more atheists. Atheists are more rational, man. I
think that's a serious problem. I think the fact that we can't have the honest conversation is what causes so much toxicity here.
Yes, I agree with that. But I also think it's a concern because I think we should be honest and say, no, dude, Trump really did give people what they wanted. He did, right? There's a reason that he was popular. A lot of these, aggrieved rural voters really like that.
I agree. So I think that.
I know you do.
I think Ezra Klein is right when Ezra Klein often makes the point that this is about fear of a Brownian country.
Yes.
Right. And he's like, let's cut through the shit. And to him, that's morally important. Now, I agree with him. I just think his moral judgment about it is completely wrong. Right? In other words, I think it's perfectly morally legitimate to be concerned about that and to have those views. And the problem is the political system rejects that. Not just the political system, but also the media. They reject that.
Right. And I think that if you view it as more just overall rapid cultural change, and demographics are just, a particularly salient subset of that. Mm-hmm. I think that you can make more progress there, because I do think that there are a lot of populist type voters who don't care about demographics per se. That is, if they lived in it, they care more about the values, right? And
I agree with that, but it's important to be clear here that when we're talking about demographics, it's not that these people are necessarily opposed to the diversity that already exists. In fact, a lot of them it. It's that they're opposed to decreasing whiteness, even, the white population even more. So that they want, essentially, they would like the demographics to remain about where they're at, right? That's what they're comfortable with.
Right.
So you can find populists in cities who are used to being around Asians and African Americans, et cetera, and they're perfectly happy with that.
Yeah, and I also think that's important moving forward, because there is this kind of multi-ethnic, populist, working class type movement, and you see that what Trump did better in 2020 with African Americans and Hispanics than he did in 2016, especially Hispanic and African American men who
Right.
have these more kind of traditional masculine values, traditional like family, community, nationalism,
But
etc.
also, and I would introduce the concept here, uh, one that Eric Kaufman makes a lot out of, ethno-traditionalism as opposed to ethno-nationalism. So ethno-nationalism is basically a commitment to a country's being dominated by a particular ethnic group.
That's right.
Ethno-traditionalism is an association with an ethnic group, but you can have a pretty a decent amount of diversity in that. So for example, it is indisputably the case that the United States is an Anglo country in the sense that it's an Anglo heritage and it's been dominated by Anglos, more or less European Anglos, for most of its history.
Yes,
And
as a historical statement that is
yes, just as a
factually
historical
indisputable.
statement.
Yes.
And there are people who are attached to that, importantly, including some African Americans and Hispanics, in the same way that there might be white people in Japan who are attached to Japanese culture and actually wouldn't want Japan to be to turn into a predominantly, say, Norwegian country or something,
Yes.
right? So this isn't. I think that's important because it's not necessarily a non-inclusive ideology, right? I mean,
That's right.
it can deal with the diversity that's already here. It just
It could
maybe
even,
we don't want any more of it.
right, and you could even deal with, although this is always a fraught issue in a multiracial society, but it could even deal with different groups taking pride in their unique heritage and coming together into this superordinate,
I
more.
think that path is dangerous, though.
I think it's dangerous, but I think the idea that you're going to stamp that out is also ludicrous because it's not happening.
Right, but the idea that you're going to stamp out murder or kin nepotism is ludicrous, but that doesn't mean you should encourage them.
Yeah, so yeah, I guess this is a separate debate whether we should,
Right.
what should, but I
Fair
think
enough, but I'll say, like, for this,
the point, I think the main point is that this kind of populism can be an inclusive political philosophy and ideology.
I agree with that. And I think that this thing, because I saw Tom Cotton on Fox talking about the immigration bill, and his claim was, his way to attack the bill was it puts foreign workers ahead of American workers.
Mhm.
And I like Tom Cotton, and he's a good immigration restrictionist. I ally with him. But you can see this sort of rhetorical street that he's forced to drive down, because the street that he'd like to drive down has been blocked by progressives and other people who control decent discourse. So he has to take this detour. And instead of saying, you know what, like, a lot of the people who vote for me don't want more racial diversity in the country, they're happy with it the way it is, he has to say it's about favoring the foreign worker. And I think this is a bad idea, because most of the literature suggests that although low skilled workers do pay an immediate price for immigration, by and large, it's good for the economy, and mostly America ends up being a winner from it. And it's a distraction.
Not only that, but I would say that type of rhetoric also encourages performative populism, right? Because if you can't say what's true to voters, somebody is going to do that and do this performative populism and say, I'm the person who's telling you what's real here, and nobody else has the balls to do that.
Right.
And I'm getting canceled for doing it, but I'll still do it because I love the people so much.
Martyr for this. What I think you're going to see, and what worries me, is that the real concern, the real source of the concern, is going to come out in the next 5 to 10 years in a much more deleterious form than it should. So it's going to be this in your face, Proud Boys, white identity shit.
It's already moving in that direction.
It's moving in that. So what you need are responsible figures to address those concerns and to be honest about them, but to do it in a way that's not so divisive and ruinous.
Mhm.
And by the way, a lot of the blame here obviously it can be heaped on the New York Times, academia, etc., and these places that have basically barred any such discourse.
That's right, because when you shut the Overton window on this, on what are real concerns of millions of citizens, whether you think that they're ethically justified or not, you create the kind of fuel for this, right?
Right, and I think it's important to note demographic concerns are not synonymous with Nazism, right? So like I understand if you have the moral view, like say, well, okay, there are 4 million Nazis in the country. Who cares? We're not going to give them an outlet to air their views. Fine, I understand that, but wanting the country to stay relatively stable in terms of demographics is not the same as wanting to enact a Holocaust. So I think the important thing is these, not only are these views that are held by, or concerns that are held by a lot of people, they're perfectly morally reasonable.
Yeah. And I think especially like also the larger issues with rapid cultural change.
Yes.
I mean, you know, traditional notions about gender roles,
Right.
religion, and how religion plays a role in public life,
Yep.
and so on. Those are all, yeah. And again, like I think the challenge is to create a kind of political philosophy, ideology movement that also is inclusive and recognizes that there are going to be political differences. There are woke people. People are just going to have more racially liberal views, and they're
Yes.
going to be more favorable toward cultural change. We have to find a way to kind of put that, not put it together in one party, but at least have people recognize that these different political parties are legitimate, and you take some policy losses when you're out of power, right? But that's okay.
Right. I agree with that. And I think one of the things that, I mean, maybe there's not this asymmetry, but it feels like an asymmetry to me here in that if you love diversity, you can go find it, right? It's not hard to find. Every major city is rather diverse. And so if you let's say you're just an ethno-traditionalist, you like rural Iowa and it's largely white and you feel comfortable there, that's not to say that you dislike other groups. It's just that's where you feel comfortable. There you can also find that, but that's becoming more rare, right?
Right. It's
So
because
I think there's a cost asymmetry to immigration at this point.
yes,
Maybe that's not true. I don't know, but it seems that way to me.
I think the reason that it's rarer and more difficult for the traditionalists to feel comfortable is because more institutions in the United States rely upon highly educated people than ever before.
Right.
So you have
They are woke, and
right, and because they are
right.
homogeneously woke, basically, and they have the successor ideology, they spread that to all of these institutions.
Yes.
So even if you're in South Dakota in a relatively rural environment, you're exposed to diversity and wokeism all the time.
Well,
you can hardly avoid it. Whereas if I'm in Chicago,
you can avoid tradition.
I avoid like
everywhere.
Any of the South Dakotan ideology is like, I'm not going to turn the news on and have like Kristi Noem preaching to me.
Right. And it's interesting because you see that even in Marietta, where I may or may not currently reside, it's a community that's very homogenous. But the college brings in diversity and tries to inject it into the neighborhood. And not only do they do that, they take great pride in it. And they deride the community because it's too homogenous. I mean, I had to listen to people ridiculing it and talking about how we need to make it more and more and more diverse. So
yes. They look down upon the townies.
Yeah, yes, they do. Yeah. And it's like, well, a lot of the people like it kind of the way it is, but you have this just this tendency, because of, yeah, you're right, the educated institutions, or the institutions that are dominated by the educated, tend to be more woke. They actually benefit from diversity, by the way, and immigration. These big companies do too. And so it's a hard fight against that.
Yes, there isn't. So there's an asymmetry in your ability to choose these different lifestyles. There's also obviously a asymmetry in the discourse and your ability to speak to these issues.
Also, you can't go, whereas you can go forward to more diversity, really hard to go backward to less diversity, right?
Right. When you create these facts on the ground,
right.
I mean,
it's hard to go back.
Yeah, agreed. So I think then we both agree with MBD. I think I appreciate his kind of populist perspective, and I appreciate the National Review moving somewhat in that direction, or at least some of the people at the National Review.
Yes.
Where I depart is I think performative populism's going to be probably the most powerful strain, not just of populism, but in the Republican Party for at least the next, 4 to 6, 8 years or so. And you might be a little bit more sanguine about a responsible populism.
I think that's probably true. I just hope like hell that it's
not. So basically, we're pretty damn pessimistic about politics, because it looks like you're going to have wokeism and the successor ideology versus performative populism.
I'm hoping for a like sort of responsible rise of a Tom Cotton type with some good institutions around him. That's the optimistic scenario.
Right. One thing that's interesting is that there is literally zero hope for a responsible Democratic Party in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's just lost there. Like, right, I painfully supported Biden with no illusions. We can get into that some other time.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, that was the end of it. It's over for the Democratic Party.
And even though I'm more of a squishy milquetoast centrist than you are, I'm done too. I'm quite confident that my future voting. I mean, Democrats at the local level, fine, but nationally, nope. All right, so that's the week summary. A lot going on. Next week, hopefully, a little less going on in the world. We'll see what happens, and we will see you next weekend.